The Principal Contradiction by TORKIL, LAUESEN, 2020. The World According to Dialectical Materialism. Knowledge. Knowledge about the world comes from human practice. Human practice is not reduced to economic production, but has many sources: class struggle, scientific and artistic activities, and so forth. But how do we acquire knowledge from practice? First, there is the immediate sensory perception of the world. You don't have concepts for things and phenomena yet, don't see connections or draw logical conclusions. Eventually, though, after ever-increasing sensory impressions, there is a qualitative leap in the epistemological process and human consciousness. Concepts begin to take form. Our ability to analyze leads us from sensory impressions to identifying commonalities between things and phenomena, and knowledge is created with the help of logic. Concept formation and logical knowledge help us to understand the complexity and essence of phenomena. We begin to understand developmental processes, see connections, and draw conclusions. Concepts are like intersections of knowledge. They help us bring order to our perception of the world and understand it. Concepts are never detached from practice. They derive from practice, and their usefulness is proven by practical application. Without practice, there are no concepts or theories. Practice, of course, means collective practice. We cannot have each practical experience individually, but we can gather many individual experiences collectively. Sensory and intellectual knowledge are of different qualities, but are not separate. Practice unites them. Knowledge begins with practical experience, our own or that of others. This is the materialist element in epistemology. To expand our knowledge, we have to move from sensory to intellectual knowledge. This is the dialectical element in epistemology. When we have gained intellectual knowledge based on practice, we have to use this knowledge. When we have attained intellectual knowledge based on practice, we have to use this knowledge. Knowledge increases not only in the qualitative leap from sensory to intellectual knowledge, but, more significantly, in the qualitative leap of reapplying it to practice. Dialectical materialism's epistemology is based on the cycle between practice and knowledge, between doing and thinking. The concept of imperialism, for example, was introduced by the English liberal economist J. A. Hobson. It was based on his observations of the development of English colonialism around 1900. Lenin expanded upon it by considering the changes in capitalism during World War I. The concept of the Third World was introduced by French demographer Alfred Sauvy in 1952, looking at political developments after World War II. The Marxist group I was a part of developed the concept of the parasite state in the 1970s based on our experience of Danish society. The concept of neoliberalism gained currency in the 1970s to describe new tendencies within capitalism. Globalization became an important concept in the 1990s. New concepts appear all the time in order to summarize and describe new realities. Using these concepts allows us to conduct new and more thorough studies of the world and reach a better understanding of how its different elements are connected and how they develop. New concepts also bring with them new institutions and new practices. Michel Foucault has traced the history of the relationships between concepts, theories, institutions, and practices in a number of books. The Order of Things, 1966, is a historical study of the emergence and classification of the modern scientific disciplines. The Birth of the Clinic, 1963, focuses on medical science, clinics, hospitals, and forms of treatment. Madness and Civilization, 1961, examines modern-day psychiatry and related institutions and therapies. Discipline and Punish, 1975, studies so-called criminal deviance, the modern-day prison, and the fight against crime. In all these books, Foucault shows how new institutions and practices derive from the conceptualization and theorization of everyday experiences. Matter and us. The materialist worldview understands matter as anything that exists objectively, that is, independent of human consciousness. In this understanding, matter does not just refer to physical things, but also to phenomena, processes, and social relationships. Let us use an important example from political economy, the concept of value. Value itself is not something we can see or touch, but we can see and touch the commodities that have value. Value is not a physical object or a physical quality inherent in commodities, but describes a social relationship. Even if the value of commodities depends upon other things, on how much work is needed for their production, it cannot be determined by the process of producing the specific commodity alone. Value can change as the commodity is moved and circulated in time and space as a consequence of competition and class struggle. Value does not consist of molecules, but is determined by the relationship between capital and labor. As Marx put it, so far no chemist has ever discovered exchange value either in a pearl or in a diamond. The relationship between capital and labor exists independent of anyone's consciousness. In this sense, it is a material relationship. Humans are a part of matter. Matter becomes conscious of itself in the human brain. In the course of history, humans have acquired ever more knowledge about matter's different forms and functions. This was a requirement for social development. The dialectical relationship between nature and society has no parallel in the animal world. Ant societies and beaver colonies are subject to laws of evolution. Humans, on the other hand, shape their own history. Human practice and social development are based on a synthesis of the laws of nature, and, more or less conscious and rational, human intervention. In the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844, Marx writes, "Man lives on nature, means that nature is his body with which he must remain in constant interchange if he is not to die. That man's physical and spiritual life is linked to nature simply means that nature is linked to itself, for man is part of nature." People get to know and change the world through practice, a practice based on their mental image of the world. As Marx points out in Capital, a spider conducts operations that resemble those of a weaver, and a bee puts to shame many an architect in the construction of her cells. But what distinguishes the worst architect from the best bees is this, that the architect raises his structure in imagination before he erects it in reality. How to interpret the world has always been a central philosophical question. Dialectical materialism, however, focuses on changing the world. The famous 11th thesis of Marx's Theses on Feuerbach, 1845, reads thus: "The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it." For Marx, however, practical change also requires a change in how we interpret the world. All the concepts introduced by Marx in Capital are characterized by a dynamic perspective of change, surplus value, variable capital, and so forth. Classical political economy just spoke of value and circulating capital. Marx's concepts themselves express a desire for change. They describe a world full of contradictions, ready to be transformed. Dialectical materialism addresses the relationship between matter, the world in itself, and our interpretation of the world for us. On the one hand, the world exists in a certain form, regardless of whether or not we exist or not. On the other hand, each human being has their own interpretation of the world. We experience the world through our senses and interpret it through our minds, and we can communicate our interpretations through speech, writing, numbers, and images. We can describe the form and the color of a teacup and the material it is made of. We can even describe its molecular structure and explain the composition of its molecules. But none of us will give us the thing in itself. The thing we get is still the thing that we experience through our own senses and interpret through our own mind, owing to our mind's ability to construct concepts and theories. These interpretations are not better or worse approaches to the world in itself. The world for us is not a bad copy of the world in itself, but it is something of a different quality. However, even if the world in itself and the world for us are qualitatively different, they are also related. This implies that the world for us is based on our relationship to the world in itself. The former provides a certain perspective on the latter. Dialectical materialism serves as an example of a perspective. A perspective can be compared to looking at something through a pair of glasses. The way the glasses are constructed and colored will determine how we see what we are looking at. Certain characteristics will make a stronger impression on us than others. They will be decisive for our perception and interpretation of what we are looking at. There is no hidden meaning for us to discover in the world in itself. What we create is a meaningful connection to it. A particular perspective is an intrinsic and inevitable feature of all knowledge. The fact that something is a perspective does not make it untrue. Yes, an interpretation can be true or false, but how we distinguish true and false interpretations depends on our perspective. While there is no point in looking for things as essence or the meaning of life, we always look for perspectives on reality that serve our interests and help us solve our problems. Dialectical materialism is the working class's method for analyzing the world and for developing strategies with the goal of changing it in accord with working class's interests. To state, on the one hand, that the world in itself exists, and to understand, on the other hand, that our perception of the world will never be anything but interpretation, shifts the focus to the glasses we are using. The fact that our examination of the glasses will also depend on our interpretation of the world doesn't make the task any easier. Dialectical materialism has given rise to many different interpretations of the world, depending on time, place, and subject. Dialectical materialism implies that the way in which we produce and distribute commodities is an important factor in our interpretation of the world. The conditions under which human beings work and live impact the way we think. Our consciousness is affected by the system we live in, but it can also help us change it. Our socialization is neither mechanical nor deterministic, it is dialectical. In his third thesis on Feuerbach, Marx writes, "The materialist doctrine concerning the changing of circumstances and upbringing forgets that circumstances are changed by men, and that it is essential to educate the educator himself. The coincidence of the changing of circumstances and of human activity or self-changing can be conceived and rationally understood only as revolutionary practice." Here, Marx distinguishes his theory from the deterministic materialism, sometimes referred to as crude, vulgar, or mechanistic materialism, of earlier thinkers. For Marx, human agency is the most important factor. Dialectics does not claim that world history necessarily entails a progression from feudalism to capitalism to socialism and finally communism. This is just one possible projection, based on an analysis of the past and present. People's conscious action is not made under conditions of their own choosing, but under conditions transmitted from the past. Dialectics points to praxis as mediating this historical process. However, action can be oriented towards explicitly defined goals, as it has been by socialists and communists, without losing itself in blueprints. In Marxism, there have been two opposing views on the process of transforming society: voluntarism and structuralism. The structuralists believe that the underlying economic and social structure determines social relations and actions. However, these structures have been created by human action. The voluntarists believe that social relations can be changed intentionally by conscious action. However, change is not dependent on only one to the exclusion of the other, but on their mutual dialectical interaction, where both are modified during the process. If the structure is functioning well, then it is difficult to create change. However, if there is a structural crisis, then action plays a decisive role. The subjective and objective are intertwined. You are a part of the world, just as the world is reflected in your consciousness. As a consequence, your actions are determined by objective conditions. However, you can act to change these conditions. This understanding of the relation between abstract and specific is the basis for the remaking of the world. Revolutionary practice is not restricted to the seizure of power, but concerns the transformation of the world as such. Theory enables you to develop a concrete analysis of the concrete situation in a specific time and place in order to change the future. Things are connected. Matter evolves according to laws that we have come to understand better over time through practice. Dialectical materialism summarizes these laws on a philosophical level. Physics deals with a certain aspect of matter, biology with another, economics with a third. Dialectics deals with the general laws that apply to all of these aspects, but dialectics cannot replace the specific scientific fields. This is a footnote with an asterisk. The physicist Niels Bohr was interested in dialectics and used his theory of complementarity to explain why matter can take the form of waves or particles depending on one's perspective. This is akin to the aspects of a contradiction. Opposites are complementary. Dialectical materialism is first and foremost a method to study society. It is, as stated above, the science of revolution. Dialectical materialism has four basic methodological rules. The first rule is that the study of all things and phenomena, as well as of the relationships between them, must take into account the things, phenomena, and relationships that surround them. Everything is connected, everything has a cause and effect, everything is cause and effect. In order to understand the development of a thing, we have to study its qualities as well as its relationships to other things. The contradictions of the thing itself are the basis for its development, but the relationship to other things are crucial for the direction the development takes and the speed at which it occurs. To illustrate this, Mao compared heating a stone to heating an egg. At the right temperature of 36 degrees Celsius, an egg turns into a chicken. A stone remains a stone. At 800 degrees Celsius, however, a stone turns into floating lava. Its inner contradictions are the basis for this change, but it would not happen without the impact of outer circumstances. The exterior interacts with the interior. To provide another example, we cannot understand the rapid development of the agricultural sector in the late 19th century Denmark without considering the demand for agricultural products in Britain, which was directly connected to industrial capitalism and Britain's colonial empire. The development of colonial capitalism impacted national developments. The emergence of industrial capitalism in Britain was tightly connected to the rise in world trade and the plunder of gold and silver in Latin American colonies, first by the Portuguese and Spanish in the 17th century, then by the Dutch, Belgians, British, and French in the 18th and 19th centuries. Colonialism pushed countries around the world in different directions. It divided the world into a center, Western Europe, and a periphery, the rest. In the same way, almost all of the world's nations were impacted by the inter-imperialist rivalry over who would inherit the mantle of the British Empire, which led to the two world wars in the 20th century. The global confrontation between the USA and the Soviet Union, known as the Cold War, was similarly significant, strongly impacting economic and political developments both in Europe and in the decolonizing world. By the end of the 1970s, neoliberalism was affecting developments everywhere, albeit in different ways. India and China, for example, have both changed significantly, but each country having its own particular contradictions, the impact that neoliberalism has had on them differs as well. We cannot understand the developments in a particular country without considering how the global and national contradictions interact. All of this might sound self-evident and trivial, but to study the world and develop strategies from a global perspective is anything but easy. There are many analyses and proposed strategies that are deeply rooted in a national perspective. They neglect or fully ignore the global one. The second methodological rule of dialectical materialism is that we need to study the development of things. Matter is in constant motion. Matter as an entity is eternal and all-encompassing, but the different forms it takes have a history, a beginning, and an end. Different social developments also have a beginning and an end. They appear and disappear. From the German ideology and the preface to A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, we can see that Marx aspired to apply the scientific approach of Isaac Newton, the founder of classical physics, to his own studies. Not in the sense that Marx wished to reduce social sciences to physics, but that he aimed to describe social phenomena with the precision of natural science. In Marx's view, there were laws for social processes, just like there were laws for physical processes. He considered it impossible to understand a society without knowing its history and the forces and struggles that drive it forward. Capitalism's history is 500 years old. It had a beginning and it will have an end, just like any other system in the 10,000-year history of humankind. Given the short span of our lives, it is easy to forget this. We have a tendency to believe that our way of life is unchangeable. It is true that capitalism is good at adapting to new circumstances and at integrating resistance, but there are limits. The third methodological rule reminds us that historical changes happen in qualitative leaps. There is no linear development, there are ruptures. Let us use an example from physics. At 100 degrees Celsius, water suddenly turns from liquid to steam. At 0 degrees Celsius, it suddenly turns to ice. At first, quantitative changes often have no qualitative effect, but there is always a point when they do, and no qualitative effect occurs without a preceding quantitative change. This is also true for social developments. The productive forces change constantly, and with them power relations between classes. Eventually, this leads to tensions that shatter the framework of the old society and make way for a new one. This happened, for example, in the transition from feudalism to capitalism. Social development is, of course, more complicated than water. There is no historically guaranteed outcome either. No law makes socialism the historical stage that necessarily follows capitalism. Capitalism's contradictions may also lead to collapse and chaos if no means for equal democratic and ecologically sustainable forms of economic production and political administration have been developed to take capitalism's place. During certain periods, our economic and political systems appear relatively stable. Even when revolutionary movements try hard to change them, they keep their balance. But they will always be affected by revolutionary efforts. They do not remain the same afterwards. During other periods, the systems find themselves in structural crises. They are no longer able to keep their balance and have become unstable, at which point revolutionary efforts take on special significance, and revolutionaries turn into butterflies who flap their wings in one part of the world and cause a storm in the other. The fourth methodological rule of dialectical materialism is that matter's development originates in the contradictions of things themselves, not in the relationships between them. We can say that each thing is defined by its own contradictions. So when we speak of a contradiction, we do not mean a logical contradiction or a contradiction in terms. The contradiction in a thing is not an error. Let us first consider the universality of contradiction, then turn to the particularity of contradiction. Each contradiction has two aspects. These aspects complement one another. They both exclude and require one another at the same time. They are like plus and minus. The form and character of things depends on how their two aspects relate to each other, how they struggle, and how they unite. Each thing carries in its inherent contradictions with it as long as it exists. When old things disappear, their contradictions disappear with them. When new things emerge, new contradictions emerge with them. The Portuguese and Spanish colonization of South America made the pre-conquest cultures of the Inca and Maya, and therefore their contradictions disappear. But it created new contradictions, first between the colonizers and the indigenous population, and later between the settlers and the colonial powers. Marx provides an exemplary description of capitalism's inherent contradictions in Capital. He begins with capital's basic element, the commodity. It is produced by human labor for exchange and implies the contradiction use value versus exchange value. Use value stands for the fact that labor, in its interaction with nature's resources and energy, is the basis of our livelihoods. Exchange value stands for the fact that, in capitalism, commodities are produced to accumulate capital. This contradiction in the commodity is expressed in labor itself. Use value in the specific labor when people sew, do carpentry, and so on. Exchange value by abstract labor in the form of time and effort of the labor power. On the market, the contradiction is expressed in the buyer's need for a particular use value and the seller's need for exchange value in the form of money. Furthermore, in his analysis of capital, Marx showed how labor power creates value, uncovering the contradiction value versus surplus value, which forms the basis of the wage versus profit relation. In later chapters of Capital, he lays out still more complex contradictions inherent to capitalism. If we look at society as a whole, the fundamental contradiction in capitalism is the one between the productive forces and the relations of production. The productive forces stand for technologies, practical and scientific knowledge, logistics, and management. The relations of production stand for the relations that humans enter when using the productive forces. First and foremost, they concern property relations. The contradiction between the productive forces and the relations of production exists in all societies. It is the contradiction that defines societies and their classes. In capitalism, we have a contradiction between the social character of production and the private ownership or the means of production, or as Engels puts it in Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, quote, the contradiction between social production and capitalist appropriation. This refers to the fact that, on the one hand, production creates the basis of our lives and develops society with the help of an extensive division of labor between workers, as well as between corporations, while on the other hand, this is done on the basis of the means of production being privately owned. That capitalism is contradictory does not mean that the productive forces and the relations of production stand in any logical contradiction to one another. It means that the social character of the productive forces and the private character of the relations of production together form a whole with two contradictory aspects. With regard to class, the productive forces versus relations of production contradiction is expressed in the contradiction workers versus capitalists. This contradiction determines when class conflicts take on a revolutionary form. This happens only when property relations come into direct conflict with the productive forces, that is, when they hinder the development of technology and knowledge. At that point, class contradictions come to a head. As soon as the consequences of the quest for profit hamper the development of the productive forces to a point where society enters an economic, political, and ecological crisis, revolution is at the door. Marx formulated this as follows. At a certain stage of development, the material productive forces of society come into conflict with the existing relations of production, or, this merely expresses the same thing in legal terms, with the property relations within the framework of which they have operated hitherto. From forms of development of the productive forces of these relations turn into their fetters. Then begins an era of social revolution. The changes in the economic foundation lead sooner or later to the transformation of the whole immense superstructure. But the consequences of revolution are never a given. Everything depends on the class struggle, on how well prepared the working class is politically and organizationally, and how national and regional class struggles interact at the global level. The development of capitalism is determined by the interaction between the economic laws of the accumulation of capital and class struggles as the social consequences of these laws. The most important elements of the capitalist economy and its laws are value and surplus value, variable and constant capital, capital's organic composition, cost price, price of production, and profit rate. The interactions between them can be expressed in mathematical formulas. But actually existing capitalism is not a machine that functions exclusively through these laws and rules, nor is it a system existing in balance and harmony. Quite the opposite. It is characterized by the struggle between the different aspects of its contradictions. For capitalism to function, it must constantly seek a form of class struggle that allows it to secure profits and continue to accumulate capital. This means that its economic laws create class struggles that affect these laws, struggles that thereby develop the productive forces and change the relations of production. This happens not only on the national level but also globally. Capitalists from different nation states have created a world market for their goods. In recent decades, production itself has become globalized. The accumulation of capital is global. Imperialist countries fight for hegemony. The economic and political balance between nation states is always changing. The dialectical process between the economic laws of capitalism, their political and social consequences, and the related class struggles is the force that drives the development of capitalism, a development that is not linear, but that zigzags and is characterized by ruptures. The division of the world into different political entities means that the transformation of capitalism into a new mode of production will require many revolutions and can be subject to reversal. The transformation from one mode of production to another is a long process. Capitalism first took shape over several hundred years, from the Italian city-states of the 15th century to the Industrial Revolution in England 400 years later. It is therefore likely that the transformation from capitalism to what will hopefully be socialism is going to be a long process as well, with its beginnings in the mid-19th century. Let us summarize the universal or general characteristics of the contradiction. Contradictions are inherent or intrinsic in all things. They remain in each thing as it develops. Each contradiction has two aspects that exclude and require one another at the same time. The aspects struggle, and their unity define the thing's form. Now let's look at the characteristics of particular contradictions. Okay, I'm going to end there.